Part A says g of f of 2. So with the composition of functions, we do the inside first, which would be figuring out what f of 2 is. So if we look at our two tables of values here, one has f of x, one has g of x. So when we're trying to figure out f of 2, we would look at the table of values that deals with our function f. So that's the first one. If we look, what happens when you plug in 2? What do you get? You get 0. So I'm going to write out a little bit more here than normal. You wouldn't write all of this out, but I'm going to say since f of 2 is equal to 0, that now tells us that g of f of 2 is the same as g of 0. I can substitute 0 where the f of 2 was, because they're equal to each other. And now we have g of 0. Well, now we're looking at our function g, which is the second table of values. And it says if I plug in 0, what would come out? What would I get? So I go to my chart here. I plug in 0. I would get 1. So g of 0 is equal to 1. And that tells us that g of f of 2 is equal to 1. In part B, we have g of 2. So we're only looking at our function g. It says, what happens if you plug in 2? What would you get? You would get negative 1. So g of 2, since g of 2 is negative 1, this is the same as g of negative 1. And what happens when we plug in negative 1? We'd get 2, so g of negative 1 is equal to 2. So what happens with the composition of functions, it's like putting things into the machines that we had, depending on which machine. In the first example, if this machine is f, and this machine is g, what we're doing with g of f of 2 is we're first putting the number 2 through f, and when we do that, out would come 0, and then that 0 goes through g, and out would come 1. Okay? Sometimes what's confusing about composition of functions is when you do the machines, f is first and then g comes after it. But when you look at the notation, the g comes first and the f is after that, reading from left to right. But if you think of BEDMAS and your order of operations, it's kind of like that. You're doing what's inside the brackets first. So that's why we're dealing with the inside of the function first, figuring that out, and then solving it all the way from that. Okay, we are going to do the first 3 examples, but I'll give you question 4 you can write down.